Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the Enlightenment. We talked about the events that led up to the Enlightenment. Now we're talking about the time when people start to use reason and science and individualism to actually improve overall society. Remember when we left off last time, we took a look at the old school versus the Enlightenment way of thinking, the idea that people are freer, that there's actual factual evidence for truth, that people are using logic, free religion, and that the idea that people actually can govern and make their own decisions. Now, think of the old school kind of like the Truman Show. All right, Truman is born into this world. Most of the world has been manipulated and created. So essentially, the people that are directing the show are going to decide what he's actually going to do, even though he doesn't really know that it's driving his actions. What the Enlightenment is at what point does Truman eventually know the truth? The first part of the movie is when a light actually comes falling out of the sky and hits the ground. Well, then what is the light that actually occurs within history where people all of a sudden go, well, wait a minute, how things have been running for, you know, thousands and thousands of years, all these pharaohs and kings and emperors and Caesars and dynastic emperors, all these chiefs. I mean, this is always how it's been. So what we need to do is that in history, we need to find the time, not when you get, Truman to know the truth, but when you actually get people to know the truth. How do you actually get people to understand that there is a different way to do things? And this is done by essentially philosophers. And these are thinkers who explore fundamental questions about humans and the world. And so they sit down, they get together, they have conversations about human nature and what life should be like, what's the purpose of people, and they come up with some fundamental ideas that actually create the modern world that you live in right now. And we're going to mention some of them, and these are the ones you're really going to have to focus on and know. And there are others, and there's science and all that. But our focus right now is going to be the ideas of how did our modern democracy come about? Number one philosopher is Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes' main theory is that people are really violent, very chaotic, and they got to have a ruler to make sure everything is taken care of. That they're not going to fight each other and kill each other and be constantly, fearful of one another. So, what this ends up doing is he comes up with this idea of the social contract. That people are going to voluntarily give up some of their freedom so that ruler could actually rule over them. All right, fine. If you're going to be fair and orderly and good to me, I will follow your laws. I'll give up some of my freedom. Now his thing was like, you know, you do still need a monarch, but the monarch should treat its people really well because you're in a social contract, and to prevent people from rising up against you, you should be kind of fair. And that's the idea of the social contract. Now, how does this impact our society? Now, this, of course, ends up being why you have a president. You need somebody up there in charge to dictate some things and to maintain some semblance of order, which is why we do still have a chief executive. We still have a leader. We still have a president. But this brings us to person number two. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose main idea is that people must be free to rule themselves. And he brings the idea of voting to the system. His idea is that whatever happens, it's the will of the people. Now, he was absolutely against a leader at all. The leader should be the community, the leader should be the people, and that the will of the people is absolute and paramount. So you'd look at him and say, well, it's kind of hard to run a government like that. But when you combine Hobbes and Rousseau together, you're getting much closer to what our government is like. The will of the people has to be followed. And that was Rousseau's big thing. So think of him and voting for laws and voting for people. You put those two together and you get the very popular John Locke, that people must have the right to life, liberty, and property, and that they can remove a ruler that abuses these rights. Look, people are born to be free, to live their lives, and to be able to acquire property. Where does this guy's ideas come up? Well, the big one is, of course, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution that says that you are born with these rights because you are a citizen of the United States and you were born in the United States. You are guaranteed with free speech and the right to bear arms, and unreasonable search and seizures by the government is not allowed. But it also allows you to vote somebody out of power that abuses those rights. That comes from John Locke. And the Declaration of Independence says that every American is born equal and that has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That comes directly from John Locke. Baron de Montesquieu, Charles Montesquieu, his primary belief is that you needed to stop a ruler from getting too powerful. And we can do that by separating government into different branches. So those different branches actually have different powers. So then no one leader can take power and abuse that power. So, like, get ahead of the game and create a system where they can't gain too much power. And that, of course, is the foundation for our three branches of government. He says split it up into legislative, a group of people that make laws. The executive is going to be your leader, they enforce the law. And the judicial are the judges, they interpret the law. And that, of course, creates our Congress, eventually, the White House, the president, and the Supreme Court. Okay. So Charles Montesquieu, I know how to create freedom for the people, is that you create a system that doesn't allow one rule to take power. Number 5 is Voltaire. Voltaire is very simple. He was big into people having the right to speak and the right to choose their own religion. And he was very critical of governments. He would often make parodies and satires and articles mocking leaders and mocking the church and mocking government. So he kind of pushed the boundaries of free speech very early on. And his contribution to us is, of course, the First Amendment of the Constitution, that Congress must respect freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the right of people to peaceably assemble, and then grieve problems with the government. So when you talk about like freedom of expression, be an individual, you be you, that really comes from Voltaire. Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was the first modern feminist. She believed that, quite simply, women should have the same rights and education as men. She came up in a time when, like, all these guys here, they really did not care about women. They looked down upon them socially, if not outright, as being inferior. Mary Wollstonecraft stepped up and said, nope, we need leaders that are educated, reasoned, and part of that is that women and men are basically equal. And she, of course, is the creator of the modern women's right to vote, women's suffrage movement. By the way, that movement did not start in the United States. That actually started in Great Britain significantly earlier, but eventually comes to the United States. And of course, in 1920, women get the right to vote. That starts with Mary Wollstonecraft. We're going to add one more philosopher on here that's not just about politics, but also about economics, about making society wealthier and happier at the same time. That one is a gentleman named Adam Smith. And Adam Smith is the founder of modern economics. Economics has a lot to do with land, labor, and capital, things you have heard about before. And his idea is that people pursue their own interests and exchanges in regard to those interests actually organize society. So he was big in the idea that people want what they want, unlimited wants and needs, and that they're going to exchange resources to get those wants and needs met. And he creates this new system, a new ideal called capitalism. That's always existed, but he's the one that actually realized people go to work for money, and then they're going to take that money and buy stuff with it. And this thing just keeps going and going and going, and it actually makes society overall better off. And he came up with the idea that your land, labor, and capital, that should really be controlled by the individual. You know, these government people should not be deciding what happens to people's land and their labor and their capital. And that the freer people are to make those exchanges, the better off overall society is actually going to be. So these are the primary ideas that came about. The social contract, which of course Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau really promoted. The idea of the rights of people, Locke, Voltaire, Wollstonecraft. Remember, a right is a freedom you have because you are human. You're born, therefore God has granted you the right to have these certain specific things, whether it's freedom, your right to your life to your right to your bear arms, free speech, all that. Also, during this period of the Enlightenment came the separation of church and state, the beginning of saying, like, maybe the church should not have so much influence over government in people's lives. Now, technically, it's the separation of church and government, but in the United States, it becomes the phrase church and state. And John Locke and Voltaire both advocated for this idea that religion should not be so involved in people's lives. Limits on government power. John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Charles Montesquieu said, look, with Locke, it's people need to be able to remove a leader that's abusive. Rousseau, you need to be able to vote out a leader. Montesquieu, let's just separate the powers out so a leader can't take power. Gender equality is Mary Wollstonecraft, well ahead of her time, but it quickly catches fire around the world, and women start to advocate for their political and social rights. And then finally, John Locke and Adam Smith with capitalism. The idea that land, labor, and capital are controlled by people and not the government. Remember, John Locke said people are born with the right to property. So he was big in private property. So these ideas really catch fire. They're written down, they're discussed. And around the world, different groups of people that did not have a voice or that did not have an understanding that they might be important start to realize, oh, I'm a peasant, but I do have these rights according to these people. I'm a slave. Well, slavery doesn't really work with people being able to have the right to life, liberty, and property. Or what about women? They're not equal around the world, but now we have people saying, yeah, they should be. Religious minorities, people like Quakers start to say, well, maybe I have a different connection to God, and maybe I want to get involved in more political things like no death penalty, or no alcohol, or no slavery, or no war, which the Quakers really got into. So religious freedom is kind of important. So all these groups get together and they start to think and they start to, plan. And eventually, of course, they're going to take these Enlightenment ideas and they're going to start to act. And that's what's going to come next.